So being a food addict doesn't mean that I just like food too much. It's not some mere lack of willpower or self-control when pizza or ice cream is put in front of me. And by the way, pizza is one of my trigger foods, so I'm really happy to be at Manhattan's tonight. What I'm talking about is a compulsion that exists within me nearly every single day to binge eat absurd amounts of food secretively. There was even a season around 5 years ago when a psychiatrist was meeting with me, and she said, you are actually a bulimic, because there was a season where I was binging and purging. And I've tried diets. I've tried slow carb, low carb, high carb, no carb, paleo, Weight Watchers, Whole30, and every single one of them ends with me stuffing a large Domino's pizza down my gullet. Manhattan's pizza's too fancy. It's too fancy and too expensive. It's got to be like cheap, nasty stuff. Now, I'm not here to tell you this evening how I overcame my addiction to food, because all you have to do is take one look at me and realize he doesn't look like he has. Food addiction is challenging because unlike alcohol or heroin or sex, you kind of need food to live. And so it ends up being this seemingly arbitrary line going back and forth, where on one side, you're eating the right amount of food. On the other side, there is overeating or binging, and there's this kind of gray line somewhere in the middle. So it's this constant tension that I carry with me, and I believe I will carry this tension with me until the day that I die. I spent years processing why I carry this burden, and specifically the childhood trauma of sexual abuse that is no doubt the primary contributing factor to my addiction. So over the last 30 years or so, I'm by no means a doctor or neurologist, but I've learned a thing or two. Doctors and psychologists, they've done a ton of research and studies over the past decades, and they've realized that a traumatic experience can fundamentally change someone's neuropathic or neurological pathway. Again, I'm no neurologist, but as far as I understand it, what that means is that a traumatic experience from my childhood has effectively rewired my brain to look for coping mechanisms, things that'll make me feel better, because when I was a kid, some really crappy things happened. In my case, I've learned it's actually a kind of a way of dealing with the ambivalence that I feel toward my own body. There's this part of me that wants to nurture myself and care for myself, and there's this part of me that actually really likes myself and thinks I'm a pretty cool person and wants to show compassion to myself. But there's this other part, sometimes it's a greater part of me, that ends up wanting to do harm, wanting to self-sabotage, to punish my body for crimes that I didn't commit. But all that aside, the single most difficult thing about my food addiction is the shame that pursues me every waking moment. It's the shame of having to explain to my wife why there are junk food wrappers in my drawer hidden, or why there were not one but 2 debit transactions from McDonald's in one day. The shame of feeling powerless to manage this addiction on my own. And especially the shame of feeling completely and utterly isolated from my own gender. Because for some reason, guys don't really like to admit that they struggle in this way. Think about it for a sec. Think about every advertisement you see for some fad diet or some eating disorder remedy. It's targeted toward women. If someone has an eating disorder in a movie or a TV show, 99% of the time, it's going to be a woman. And I want to stand in solidarity with my female friends who have battled with eating disorders and body and health image issues. But I got to tell you, it gets a little lonely sometimes. At least it feels that way. And I know there are likely millions upon millions upon millions of guys who struggle in this way. But somehow it's this socially acceptable thing. It's just what guys do. In fact, we kind of laugh at it. We make jokes about it. One of my favorite all-time Simpsons episode is an episode where Homer decides he wants to work at home. So to do that, he has to get a disability. And the disability that he decides upon is that he's going to reach 300 pounds. And so to reach 300 pounds, he eats all sorts of greasy, nasty food, and eventually reaches that point, and he walks around, or doesn't walk around, and just pushes buttons all day at home and wears a muumuu. It's fantastic. But for me, I don't care whether something is socially acceptable or not. I know that the battle I face is not just a battle of physical wellness, but it's a battle of emotional wellness, of mental wellness, and spiritual wellness. When my body is unwell, it's a symptom and sign that other things within me are not right. The other week, I was looking for something just as a bit of encouragement on my journey, and I was going to take the dog for a walk and thought I'd throw on a podcast. And so I started looking for something that might, be helpful and beneficial. So I did a little search on my phone and found this podcast, and it was entitled Intuitive Eating for Binge Eating Recovery. And I thought to myself, that sounds really good. It was a little cheesy a few minutes in, but I kept listening because there was some decent content. But then halfway through, the woman says to the audience, she says, I just got to say, you got this, girl. You got this, girl. And as I was walking my dog, I just started shrinking. I was like, It's frustrating. It's frustrating. Now, even in this, I feel a tension because I don't want to suggest for even a moment that because eating disorders are often seen to be something that women struggle with, that makes me inferior as a male. In fact, I would say the opposite, that women, the reality is that women are quicker to vocalize and address these issues, and it shows their strength. But what I experience is this internal battle. It's this battle of self-imposed and society-enforced shame that I'm struggling with something that most of my gender doesn't like to admit that they struggle with. So I think to myself, I just must be weak. I just must lack discipline. I'm a mess. And what I'm realizing more and more is that it's okay to be a mess. Because are we all a mess in our own little way? I'm discovering that it's okay to not be okay. That my journey is my journey, and it's fruitless to compare it to anyone else's. And the more I learn to accept myself and my struggle, the less shame I feel, and the more I'm actually able to move forward and actually see some change in my life. I'm recognizing within all this is the power of community and vulnerability. I'm discovering the power that my story has, and not just in sharing it with them and helping them, but also just when I share it actually helps me too. So tonight is his own little form of therapy in a way. So whenever I become vulnerable with my congregation on a Sunday morning or at MoMondays to a bunch of strangers and friends, the shame of the struggle gets driven out and there's room for just a little bit more light. In fact, I have this little group of guys that we get together very regularly, and we intentionally share about everything that's going on in our world. It's one of the most beautiful things because you just don't hear about this very often. It's actually the point of us getting together. It's not like we just get together and say, hey, let's have a beer and let's see what happens. It's like we get together and there is an intention to say, we are going to dig up each other's dirt, and it's going to be fun. We share about how our families are doing and how we're succeeding and struggling at work and home, and then we get pretty honest about sharing the things that we're struggling with and the things that we've done to harm people around us. And we get to encourage and support one another in that process. And every time we get together, my burden feels a little lighter. My shame feels lessened, and I realize I'm not alone. And that's the most important thing that we can ever realize. And this is the power of community and vulnerability in action. Social worker and author Brene Brown, she says it like this: owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy. The experiences that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. So, my promise to our world that as a man, I will not stop talking about my struggle. I will silence the shame that tells me that my story doesn't matter, and I will show everyone, but especially my guy friends in this room and elsewhere, the deep power of owning and sharing all of our vulnerability and weaknesses. Because when I am weak, that's actually when I'm strong. Thank you.